In this video, I'm going to talk about how combat works for the game. Now, before we get into the mechanics of the combat, I'll also explain how you get into combat, how combat works. In this example, I'm going to suppose that I've got some allied forces in these two zones here, and in the movement turn, I spend command points to move them into this new zone here. And this is a zone they haven't been in before. In this example, there we go. Okay. Later in the turn, I will be rolling dice on charts to see what I encounter in that zone. And in this example, I will suppose that we encounter some German infantry units and a Stug. Before I engage in combat, in the combat phase, and I have to engage in combat because in the combat phase, if you find yourself in a zone where there are your counters and enemy counters, then combat has to take place. Before I do that, I have to determine, using command points, what type of attack I would like to do. I can do a normal attack, which costs 0 command points, but the enemy will fire on me first. Or I can spend 2 command points and I can do a coordinated attack where I will attack first. That's an important mechanic, it's an important decision the player has to make. Often you'll find yourself in a position as the player that you will not have enough command points to be able to do those coordinated attacks. Certainly not within a turn to be able to do all the combat. Depends on previous decisions that you've made. In this example, I'm going to assume that I choose not to spend any command points and the Germans get to fight first. I can, before any combat's decided and done, I can also choose to spend command points on artillery strikes and airstrikes. In this example, I'll come back to those, how they work, but I'm not going to use those, but that's an important part of the decision making for the combat encounter. In addition, the enemy can also use airstrikes and artillery strikes against me, and that is determined by what I roll when I go into that zone and encounter that zone. But in this example, let's keep it nice and simple to begin with. Let's just do a straightforward combat. The way that combat works is very straightforward. You'll need a couple of d6. You don't need many. 2 or 3 at maximum. And the enemy will fight first in this example because I chose to do a normal combat, 0 command points spent. The way that combat works is that the enemy will fight first and they will fight against a similar counter. And what I mean by that is we've got 2 infantry counters and a Stug, which is a self-propelled gun, which is an AFV counter. The Stug will fire on either of the 2 Shermans and the player will decide which one it fires against. And the infantry counters will fire on my infantry counters, and again the player will decide which counters that those 2 will fire on. The fire cannot be split over multiple counters. So in this example, the infantry counter, the German infantry counter, is rolling 2 dice. It has to roll both those 2 dice against one counter. It cannot roll 1 dice against one and 1 against the other. Same applies for the Stug. It will be rolling 3 dice against the Sherman. Again, just for anyone who's not watched the video on the counter description, the first number is the number of dice you're rolling against infantry counters. The second number is the number of dice you're rolling against AFV counters, which are tanks. If you haven't watched that video, it's worth checking out. In this example then, I'll line the counters up nicely, just to illustrate the example. You don't need to do that, it's up to you. He's firing against this one, this counter's firing against this one, the Stug's firing against that Sherman. I simply roll 2 dice, and I need to get 6s to hit the enemy, the infantry counter. So I get a 1 and a 4. Neither of those two hit. Then it's this counter's turn, and let's suppose I get a 1 and a 6 just to demonstrate the mechanic. That counter has now been hit, and the player can roll a saving throw for that counter. I need a 6, and that's the number in the bottom right, and it's modified by the zone that I'm in. This is a sort of non-modified zone. It's the neutral green, so there's no modifier. I'll show an example in a second for what happens if there is a modifier. I roll the dice and I get a 4, so I do not get a 6. That counter is now hit. I roll another dice on a chart to see what happens to the counter. If it's a 1 to 4, the counter is hit and pushed back. If it's a 5 or a 6, it's destroyed. Let's suppose it's a 4, and that counter is then pushed back into either of those two zones here and is flipped. The player chooses which zone it gets pushed back into. I'll push it back into that zone there, and is flipped. That counter can be rallied in the rally phase of the next turn, if I choose to spend the command points to rally it. But effectively it's out of action, taking casualties out of the fight. The Stug will be rolling 3 dice, and again, let's say it gets a 3, a 4, rolls again and gets a 1. So 3 dice, no hits. Now it's the player's turn to do exactly the same thing. So I can now go, okay, this will fire twice on that counter, twice on that counter. The Sherman will fight against the Stug, and this Sherman will fight against the Stug. That's a key mechanic. The player who has the higher number of counters will be at an advantage. So in this example, I could, if I wanted to, fire both those 2 counters against that one, if I wanted to. But in this case, I'm not going to. I'm going to do straightforward. And let's roll some dice to see what happens. So I get a 1 and a 1 snake eyes. No result. This one, I'm rolling 2 dice. I get a 2 and a 3, no result. And let's say the Shermans between them get a 6. It doesn't matter if you get a number of 6s, just one will do. If they're rolling 2 dice against AFVs and 2 dice against AFVs, so rolling 4 dice. Let's say I get 4 6s. It doesn't matter how many you get, you just get a hit. The Stug will be making a saving throw. Its saving throw is a 5, so it needs a 5 or more, modified by the terrain, and there isn't any modifiers on this terrain zone. Let's say it gets a 2, fails the saving throw. I roll the dice to see what happens to it again. 1 to 4, it's pushed back. 5 or 6 is destroyed. I get a 6, it is out of the game. And that is a simple example of a combat round. These counters would now stay where they are until the next turn, and then I would go through the same combat experience again. So artillery, the player has, before any combat has taken place, once the player's decided what type of attack they are going to do, they can decide if they want to spend more command points on artillery strikes and airstrikes. And say they want to spend command points on artillery strikes. When you artillery strike the enemy, you roll for the artillery strike before any combat's resolved, and you'll be rolling d6 against suitable targets. Suitable targets for artillery strikes are infantry-based counters, and the artillery is supposed to be light artillery, and you roll the dice as normal. You roll 1 dice per counter, and let's say you get a 5 on that one, and you get a 6 on this one. The 6 would hit as normal. There is no additional cover save or no bonus cover save for the zone when being hit by artillery. In this zone, it doesn't matter because there's no bonus. But if there was, that would be negated by the artillery. It's particularly useful against zones that are yellow or red, and the red zone actually gives you a bonus when using the artillery for wood splinters. But in this example, there are no bonuses. So the player, that one's hit, we roll again for its save. Let's say it gets a 5, so it doesn't save. You'd roll again to see what happens to it. It gets a 2, so it's pushed back into that zone there. The player would decide which zone it's pushed back into. Let's say it's pushed back into that zone there. If you're using an airstrike, the airstrike works exactly the same way, but it hits against AFEs. So you do exactly the same process. Before combat, the one thing you cannot do is you cannot start combat and then go, oh, actually, things aren't going so well, I'll use an artillery strike. You have to determine it before the combat starts. Airstrikes work in exactly the same way, and let's say it knocks the Stug out. If the player wants to, they can use both artillery and airstrike. You can use both. You've got to spend the command points. If the player wants to, they can use airstrikes, artillery strikes, and a coordinated attack and go all out in a zone. What that effectively means, you'd be doing airstrikes against infantry, airstrikes against AFVs, artillery strikes against infantry, and then you would be attacking first. That's singularly giving you the best odds at defeating the enemy in a zone. But it costs a lot of command points to do so. And in the game, you will often find yourself in a situation that you will not have enough command points to do that in every zone that has combat. So it's part of the sort of decision-making aspect of the game. You've got to decide which zones you're going to pour command points into. If, as an example here, as a result of combat, I've defeated all the enemy counters and I'd pushed back that German infantry unit into that zone, the next time I go into that zone, so I go into that zone next turn, I'd roll to see what happens in that zone as normal, and if that resulted in enemy units, they would be in addition to the infantry unit that's already there. The difference between the AI and the player, if the player is pushed back, remember the counter is flipped and has to be rallied. The enemy don't have that; they just simply get pushed back, and you can push them all the way back off the board. If they get pushed off the board, then they're out of the game. So hopefully that gives you an overview of how combat works. Like I said, you'll need a couple of dice, a couple of d6. I've designed it very deliberately so that you can hold all the information in your head and on the counters. So counters have the number of dice you need to roll. It's always 6s to hit. The counters have the saving throw information. There's only one chart that you need, which you can memorize easy, which is a chart that you roll on to determine what happens to the unit when it's hit. And it's I've designed it very deliberately to be a streamlined process. And the reason for that is, in this example, I've just done one combat in one zone. You may find yourself having combat in 3, 4, 5 different zones all within a turn. So I need the combat to be pretty quick and fluid, and without the need for looking up countless charts or rules, etc. It's a very streamlined process. Hopefully that gives you an overview. The last thing I should probably talk about actually before I finish this video is those save modifiers from different zones. So in this zone, you've got the yellow artwork here. That represents the zone has cover for the enemy, not for the player. So let's just use an easy example. Let's say I've got one infantry counter in there and one German counter in there. That German counter would get a +1 to their saving throw. So rather than needing a 6, they would need a 5 or more to successfully save. So let's say I attack the German infantry there. I roll 2 dice. I get a 3 and a 6, which hits it. You'd roll then to see what happens to if this counter saves. It would normally need a 6, but in this case, because it's in the yellow, it would need a 5. Remember what I said about using artillery strike. If I'm artillery striking into that zone, then that negates the yellow. So you don't get the +1. You need a 6 as normal to save that counter. So the natural cover in the zone always benefits the defender. Or the enemy is probably a better way of saying it. So that's an important mechanic. There is a zone this way on the map, you can just see it in there, that's red. and that has special rules associated with it. It's a heavy forest area, and that again is covered. So some of the zones have special rules. They will be covered in the explanation for the scenario. The scenario also details how many command points you're going to be rolling for every turn. Hopefully that gives you a good overview of the combat. And yeah, thanks for watching as always.